Hello, welcome. There's an enormous storm is about to break here, so if you hear some thunder and lightning going on, the dog will start barking as well anyway, so you'll soon know. And today I want to talk about a really important idea, a scientific idea in each one that will really help open our minds and expand. It's a little bit of a more advanced idea, and it's one of the things that's working towards eventually where we'll discuss, hopefully at the end of this series, the idea of the natural set versus cultural sets. And this is all to do with the way that force is transmitted. So the scientific ideas around the methods of force transmission. And understanding these, and when you understand this, it really helps you understand a lot about Chinese martial arts and different kinds of Chinese martial arts. And also the genius of each one in the way that it tends to merge these different kinds of force transmission. So the first thing is the idea of Fa-Li itself, and I know there's lots of discussion around Fa-Li, and there's always this tendency in Chinese martial arts where people like either over mystify things or oversimplify things, and we've got to find the thing that's in the middle, the thing that's actually genuinely real. And Fa-Li is a real thing for now. We'll say short, sharp movement. And I've talked multiple times about you've got to develop over time, you've got to develop a sophisticated understanding of these concepts that's rational, that links step by step, and you can't just get it across immediately to a beginner. You've got to build the knowledge and understanding. That's very different to what usually happens, which is you start with a beginner who thinks that's all nonsense, and then you steadily brainwash them until they believe nonsense, and that's like what happens in a lot of cases. A real rational scientific approach begins in straightforward terms, and then maybe it can become a little bit more abstract philosophically, but physiologically the concepts have got to make sense, even if it uses some concepts that are quite interesting at first and maybe you don't quite get, like around visualization and like the idea of Fa-Li, we've talked before, like a short, sharp movement is usually just in the core of the body, one of these axes, either horizontal or vertical. But the movement itself can be long, the movement itself can be big, but the actual engine, the driver of the movement, the Fa-Li, the biggest part of it is in the core, and it's a short movement, so a short, sharp movement. We've also talked about this idea, structural expansion, where you hear and you expand or contract, very short movement in a very fast motion, and that creates force. And the next thing is, well, how do we take that force? Okay, you've created force, but how do you hit with it? How do you make that force go to a particular target? And that's everything we've looked at around the idea of structural configurations. And one of the interesting things about this is, in the Yiquan paradigm, we have this idea of hunyuan, and I've said it like everything, it's contradictory, and it encompasses multiple different things that you can't get that at first. It's a holistic understanding. It's one of those idea systems where you need to kind of understand everything, and it just kind of clicks into place. And in the past, you just trust your teacher, and you wouldn't worry about not understanding it. You just train, and eventually things will click into place. Things are very different now, I think, because well, there's various things going on that you would think like each one hasn't got much of a future because people just not seeing the results and people just don't buy the ideas, so that's kind of difficult. Nonetheless, the idea of hunyuan is very contradictory. It's very interesting because like as it's traditionally presented, the idea of so let's say I'm going to hit with this hand and my whole body expands, what we call structural expansion. Short, sharp movement, goes from a small movement to a bigger movement, and it expands, and there's force in every direction, so we can see where that posture's setting back like that, and there's force going that way, and this arm's going that way, and so on. And I said before, some people kind of draw diagrams to show how everything's going in different directions, which is very trivial. To me, it's a very trivial understanding of hunyuan. But what's really interesting about this is that takes on a life of its own. So hunyuan starts becoming ideologically transformed into some kind of, like when people say internal force, and that takes on a whole different dimension. It goes beyond the physical mechanics of the body and becomes something else like chi, or something that's downloaded into the body from the cosmos, and you access some kind of primordial spiritual or exotic, let's say exotic. That's a wonderful word, isn't it? Because it neither implies scientific nor spiritual. Some kind of exotic force is unleashed. And Hunyuan Li takes on very much that kind of idea in people's minds. People are pointing expectation about that, and it becomes very difficult to disappoint that expectation. Then on the other side of the coin becomes over disappointed into just being something like mechanical, simplistic and mechanical, and it's not that either. So anyway, we'll come back to that. So what's then really interesting about that is there's a very contradictory thing going on here, and I've talked before about the justification for something coming after the thing itself. And it's an idea that comes to us from Confucius directly. This idea, I said before, he talks about people being buried, and then all the paraphernalia around burials and afterlives and so on comes after that. We see that all the time in martial arts, where something's done a certain way. It's done a certain way for a certain reason, but the explanation for it comes afterwards to justify it, and that makes it then very difficult to correct something that's wrong. And Hunyuan Li is very much like this, so it's a very contradictory and advanced idea. So let's start from brass tacks and say, well, actually, the reason Hunyuan Li is there isn't because it's some kind of exotic force, it's because this is how power is generated in Yiquan. So all the stuff that we've been talking about, particularly the use of the kind of outlying parts of the body, like the arms and the hips and the shoulders, that work when we use this kind of structural expansion or contraction. It's the same principle, it makes no difference. To suddenly expand very short space and move like that. That's how it functions. Everything just expands like that. So by definition, everything is going kind of out like an explosive movement out. Everything is going out in multiple different directions. I know like it starts sounding like a kind of religious thing where people talk, calling other people heretics and things like that. But the difference is, can you rationally and scientifically explain why you're saying it in the way that you're saying it? So this is how power is generated. This explosive movement goes from smaller to bigger like that. We can see exactly how it functions. You can see everyone, really, anyone who throws a punch does that, like it is using like a kind of version of Hunyuan Li where they just change, the body expands in some way, open or closed, up or down. The body expands, or the physical space that the body takes up expands, and that generates force if you do it fast. And so by definition, it's Hunyuan Li of a kind, and then becomes a more refined structural, because it has this hit to the lock point in each one, but you just stop and everything just is structurally curtailed like that. You don't just explore that. It's what everyone does to generate force. It's just a different culturally defined method of doing it in each one, because we use the structural movement, and we use bow, this kind of embracing rounded posture, and we use structural curtailment to stop the posture at a certain point and not go past the hit point. So it gives it a very particular kind of look, and then by definition everything's just expanded like that. There's other dimensions to Hunyuan Li that are involved in the interconnection between the joints and so on. Again, let's come back to that in a moment. And for now, say it's very interesting how then that gets transformed into the idea of like some kind of force, and then it's like, rather than, for example, a way that force is expressed, which is much more accurate description of what we're doing with Hunyuan Li. When it gets described as a force, you start transforming its nature into something exotic and separate from the physical movement of the body, and that's very problematic. And this is something that Wang Shijia himself tells us, that if you can't properly explain how, even if you can do it, if you can't properly explain what it is that you're doing, then when you explain it to other people, they start trying to follow your explanations rather than what you're doing. And that misleads them, because the explanation is wrong. So by definition, it misleads them. So it doesn't even matter if you can do it right. The explanation is wrong. It misleads other people. This is one of the problems with the idea of fascia, I have to say, that's become popular recently. That even if people can do something and they're using the idea of fascia, well, that explanation is not right. It's, you know, fascia doesn't have any of the capacities that people are talking about. And some, you know, I'm a professional academic. I work in a university that trains medical professionals. I've read some of the literature around this. It's just pseudoscientific nonsense. So, of course, fascia is real, but people looking for an explanation for, well, how for example, does explosive movement work and integrated body movement, and it's nothing to do with it. It's like, for example, think about one of these drone displays where all the drones are working together, and you try to say, well, what is it that makes them work together like that? And you open up the drone and you're looking at it, and you're looking at the material that covers the workings of the drone. It's like, no, it's the computer program that links all these things together that creates this effect, and it's their interaction between these two. And that's very much analogous to intent and physical form and how they link together and how they function. And it's nothing to do with, well, fascia just doesn't have the capacity and the powers that people are ascribing to it, and nor does this thing that people start doing now work, where they reinvent things that people said in the past about tendons and ligaments to mean fascia. It's just, again, it's an example of the same thing. Like the mistake happens, and then the ideology comes to justify the mistake. So it's nothing to do with that. So people start pursuing the wrong thing. So if you start pursuing hunyuan li as a force, then you start pursuing the wrong thing. Whereas what you need to be pursuing is structural movement, but intentional structural movement. This is the other thing that people are very fond of saying, or some people are very fond of saying, like, again, it's always obnoxious, it's never really helpful, it's always point scoring, and it's always point scoring from people who've otherwise got absolutely nothing to demonstrate or show by way of actually using their ideas practically, where they will say each one's about the intent, you know, the intentfulness of the body, or the intent within movement. And Wang Xingjai literally says, look at all these people who talk about intent being in the body, and when you ask them to demonstrate it, none of them can, you know. So it's easy to say that kind of thing, and each one is contradictory. So you've got to understand that actually everyone already does that. Everyone's body is already full of intent. If you can move voluntarily, then your body is already full of intent. Each one doesn't teach you that. Each one provides a training method for doing that, using that mastery for a different purpose and honing it and crafting it in a different way. You're already the master. Your body's already full of intent. Walk down the road, that's intentional movement. Otherwise you'd just fall over and lie there and wouldn't move. You'd just be like a one-person Radiohead video ending. So the misconception of hunyuan li as a force comes after the physical reality of, well, this is how you generate power. It's a really basic material concept, biophysical concept, and then it gets described as like this kind of omnidirectional force, and then it becomes like a separate exotic thing, that it's a force that well, how do I get hunyuan li? I'm doing the movement, yeah, but it is that. So disappoint that expectation. But one of the problems with that then is that it misleads people into like, well, the power should be equal in all directions. You hit out in all directions, and that then leads you away from the requirement that, well, actually you've got a target, and it's not efficient to release force in all directions. That's not efficient at all. You need to target most of your power to the target point. It's inevitable, like, you know, for example, if I do this and this, what we call an intentional arc, the way the arms move together like that, this is going back like that, and I'm going to hit out like that, this way, that there's force going in different directions, and we want it to all be explosive. So if someone catches that as they're going back, then, you know, it's going to be a stinger on the nose, it's going to be a tooth cracker. But I want most of my force to go out into the hit point, and that's when we start learning about, same thing Wang Xingjai talks about, like developing hunyuan li, the feeling of hunyuan li in standing, but then changing it into movement so that you can use structural configurations to transmit force to a particular point. So the idea of hunyuan li itself becomes very misleading and leads people away. Either leads people into like the most trivial mechanical explanation, which doesn't explain the importance of the way intent functions to link everything together and create the right form of consistency in the body. But it also, it makes people focus on the idea that some kind of exotic force will possess you, but it also leads you away from the science of structure and the science of Chinese Wushu, and that preamble is to link us into a couple of key ideas that we want to look at today. So once we've got the explosive movement, the Fa Li, which by definition is this kind of explosion in all directions, then we've got to transmit force to a particular point. And force transmission has different ways of functioning, and it's a really interesting idea. Like, we inherit this kind of assumption, as I said before, I'm a social scientist. I've got a very specialist interest in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of social science and natural science. And we tend to think, like, lay people just assume that cause precedes effects, and that's the way everything always functions. So that filters through into the way we think about force transmission in each one, anything like where you develop hunyuan li and you use hunyuan li to issue force, and all our focus is on the move, like the explosivity of the movement, and it's almost like this exotic power will somehow then just work, and at the point that we've hit the person, everything's already done, and somehow they fall over. Whereas cause and effect don't always work like that. I'm not saying, some bizarre things obviously going on, being discovered in quantum physics, but apart from that, actually cause and effect can be simultaneous, and that's something that people very rarely think about. So the classic example that's always used in philosophy is water in a glass. The water's held in the glass, and that cause and effect are simultaneous. A similar thing is happening here. So when we hit and the force transmission takes place, it isn't just because we used hunyuan li as the cause, and then at the point we hit, it has an effect. Actually, at the point where we hit, simultaneously force transmission and the effects of that force transmission are going to take place. So yes, okay, we use the short movement, and we're using this, what we describe as hunyuan li, to generate force, but we've got to transmit that force into the target, and that happens when the contact point is made. When we do it on the air, we call it a lock point, but when it's a hit point, then the force is transmitted at that point. And why that is important is because the configuration of your structure determines how much or how little force gets transmitted. And the easiest example of that I've used before is that usually when you spar like you're holding an egg like that in your hand, so that when you hit, you don't transmit force in the same way as if you make a proper clenched fist. You transmit much more force, and sparring becomes much more of a brain injury hazard. So that's exactly what happens, but on your overall body. If your structure is too loose, then the force transmission is lost. And these are all ideas that we've looked at before. If the structure is too tense, then you can transmit force, but like Wang Xiangai says, the structure becomes too brittle. So you can really tense when you hit, but not only do you slow down the speed of the impact by doing that, and so lose some of the force that you want to transmit, but you also make the body brittle, i.e. you can really injure yourself, or there's no resilience in it. So if you hit someone who's really, really tough, or they're coming in, or they headbutt your fist or something like that, and it injures you rather than injuring them, or injures both of you because it's too stiff and brittle. We know those ideas, we've looked at those ideas, and we've also begun to look a little bit about alignment, and that's the important things to get from this lesson today, and begin thinking about alignment. And one of the key differences in ways that we can align is to align through bone structure and use induction through bones, and the other way is to align through musculature and use a different kind of induction through musculature. Simplest way to explain that is like a direct punch where the bones are pretty much in line all the way down the body. Let's say like a traditional kind of Shaolin Chuan punch, where the point where you hit, the induction of the force that you generate goes down a very straight, and it's rooted back into the shoulder, And this very solid structure allows you to transmit a lot of force. Similarly from Shaolin, very old Shaolin, the kind of thing you see on the walls of the Shaolin temple. This kind of hit where you swing in like this. Most of the natural set is based around ideas and concepts like this. It's the simplest way of transmitting force. You treat outlying part of the limb as a kind of missile, and you swing it and use momentum and swing in and hit. And when you do that, for example, when I'm hitting in that way, most of the force is going that way. Most of the force that I've generated is being dissipated, and it relies very much on the strength, first of all, of the bicep to hold this arm here, and then this muscle group here around the shoulder and chest to keep the arm strong and to lock it so that it doesn't go floppy and just lose all the strength. So it relies a lot on muscular strength in a way that doing it like that still relies on muscular strength, but the way that the bones are aligned allows you to induct more force into the target, and it's also much stronger, physically stronger and easier to control, and requires less, for example, less bicep, chest and shoulder strength than doing this. And if you ever get on a bag and try those two things, then you'll feel the difference in those two kinds of ways of moving. And one of the ways that the natural set and the cultural set function, there's no such thing really as a natural set. Everything's partly cultural. We'll look at that another time. But one of the ways that the natural set functions is that it's a simple law of physics that you can just swing in and hit with these kind of movements. And similarly for kicks as well, kicks in a natural set, those kind of swinging movements they suggest themselves naturally and intuitively. It's why if people are untrained, like the fights tend to just go like that, or even when they are trained you still see that. It's very much how other primates fight as well. Getting more bone alignment, using bone alignment and bone induction is a much more, like it's something that has to be culturally developed. It's something that's got to be worked out that you can do that. It's much less intuitively natural. And that's why you see, I've talked before, these big differences in kind of each one, where you do see that very often just using these natural set movements. And then the difference between that and a cultural set, which will look much more like something like boxing or bagua or hunyuan, because those are cultural sets. Hunyuan is a very good example of something that's much more a cultural set anyway, but using inline bone alignment. And I've talked before about how it even goes to the point of ideologically using the idea that it develops from spear use to explain why it's so linear. And we can compare that with Tai Chi, which uses much more this kind of muscular alignment rather than bone alignment to move people. It's much closer to the natural movement. It's much closer to the natural set. And yet both of those things are wushu. They're different ways of using force transmission. Yes, I know, of course, Tai Chi has punches and strikes in like that. But even when you strike anyway, if you're striking in like this, anything that's using the muscles to control the alignment of the body and to control the force induction, anything like that is closer to what we would call the natural set, and it's a different kind of induction. One of the really interesting ways of thinking about this actually is that bone alignment or bone induction, when we hit much more in line like that, really amplifies force transmission, whereas when we use something that's much more from the natural set that relies on muscular strength and muscular alignment, which includes, for example, in many ways, higher level ability to get the right kind of relaxation, because the same rule about being brittle applies if you're too tense. It's really easy to pull a muscle. That's less about amplifying force transmission than it is about preserving force transmission. So when you hit with muscular alignment like this, if the muscular tension is wrong, then all of these are potential weak points, and force is lost anyway, even if you get it absolutely right, because of the movement, because you can control movement going straight back like that. You can control it much more easily, locked back into the shoulder, just because of the size of the muscles that are controlling it. So, you recognise it's always a combination of bone alignment and muscular alignment, but it veers much more towards one than the other, depending on which kind of wushu you're doing. All of these points are points where force can be dissipated if the tension is wrong in the joints and the muscles that are controlling the joints. And if the tension is wrong, then force is dissipated and lost. So it's about preserving the force that you generate from this movement much more than it is about amplifying it. Whereas if you hit much straighter, then it's about amplifying that movement. And that really opens your mind up a lot about even just looking at hunyuan and tai chi, where you can see, these are, each one's taken one of these principles and really focused on that as its primary core movement concept in the way that it functions. But you think straight away, like, well, there's other movements, aren't there? And it's like, well, what's a hook, for example? What's a hook? Well, actually, it's using muscular alignment rather than bone alignment. And this is one of the reasons why the idea of kinetic chains is problematic, and I've talked before about this. These ideas become popular and they're useful as shorthand, but exactly the same process occurs where they take on a life of their own and they become like some kind of exotic force or something that people are using. And before you know it, it's like, you've got to use fascia alignment, or you've got to use kinetic chain alignment and so on. Well, the phrase kinetic chain, it's not that scientific anyway, so there's 1,001 different ways of using that idea. So if you criticise one, well, inevitably loads of other people use the idea in a different way. But you can say fairly clearly, this for me, this is the idea of a kinetic chain when it's much more bone alignment than it is when it's muscular alignment. And the reason for that is kinetic chain to me implies force amplification through bone induction, like the force travels pretty easily down the solid bone structure like that. Whereas if I hit with a hook or something like that, when I'm hitting this way, so much force is lost that way, and I've got to control that with the bicep and the chest and shoulder muscles that way. So it's much less about induction, it's much more about preserving, it's much less about kinetic force transmission, generation, yes, force generation through the use of Fa Li, for example, in each one. And similar if we do that, it's a slightly different posture. And the reason for looking at the hook like that is that it then links into the idea that I've talked about before, that, for example, the difference between this kind of movement, like a close hook, and a big natural set clothesline like that, is that when you hook in close like that, it makes a really tight muscle group, which makes it much more easier to control. You don't want it to be too tense, of course, for all the reasons we've talked about, but it's a much stronger structure. So it's mimicking bone alignment, because that's a really strong structure just pushing back like that. It's mimicking that concept, but in the context of muscular alignment. And you can feel straight away the difference when you do it like that this muscle is stretched out now. It's suddenly a lot harder to control that structure than it is when you do that. And you can feel the difference in how much force is going to be lost just by opening it out like that. So those two different ways of using force and the generation of force. And critically, those things happen at the moment when you hit the target. So yeah, okay, you use Fa Li and you're using hunyuan Li, then at the point where you hit the target, force has got to be inducted to the target that way. And similarly, this way, at the moment where you hit the target. So it's not just about you can develop hunyuan Li and somehow that will magically and exotically transfer itself over into the person. There's a science of the transference of power that you generate into the target. And it's by no means just the idea of force goes in every direction, let's have an arrow pointing in every direction. There's really sophisticated things going on that you've got to cultivate in terms of how you use structure to either transmit or maintain, not lose force, for example, through loose muscular movement and so on. there's a whole science around that and transmit that to a certain point. And Wang Xianjia himself told us that, so it's quite interesting and problematic how the idea of hunyuan is kind of been transformed into this exotic thing. And one of the ways of that happens is through the idea of mind force, which is a translation that some people use when Wang Xianjia is talking about the role of intent in using the body. And you can see fairly clearly when people are talking about this concept of mind force that they've made this mistake, that they've created an exotic power that they think somehow, like they're missing the link between, well, how does that knock someone out? You know, how does that happen? And they've misunderstood the idea that, well, the mind controls the body. You know, the intent floods and controls the body, and it manages all of these micro movements, these micro systems that link together into the whole structure and the way that it functions. And it has to do lots and lots of different things. And creating that, or not, it's not creating it, it's repurposing that connection, recognizing that the intent is connected into the body in a very sophisticated way, which we are. Wang Xianjia himself says we're socialized out of recognizing that. We're socialized into just thinking of, like, you know, intent is just in our head, whereas actually we reconnect back into our body to be able to operate this system in a very sophisticated way. And that's what we can genuinely call, like, you know, the internal forces, not an exotic power or an exotic substance, something like that, but actually the way that the body functions using all these different forces and screwing forces and oppositional forces and body tension and body alignment, bone alignment, muscular tension, and so on. So it's quite an advanced concept. Well, the next thing to understand about that is that, well, each one's very much about the doctrine of the mean. So one of the genius things about each one is the way that it links these two together. And I have talked about that before, the way that it combines both and tries to get the best of both worlds. And one of the reasons that the more natural movements, what we might call something veering towards more like the natural set, kind of thing you see on the walls of Shaolin Temple, one of the reasons why people do that is it generates so much power, like these big swinging movements like that. You can really get your, you know, all the muscles control, all the muscles involved in the movement to make them function like that. I mean, it's a simple law of physics, isn't it? Like it's like having a ball on the end of a rope and swinging it, whacking it like that, you know. And that's just the same thing we want to do with, like, a big forearm hit or something like that. And it's over-determined because actually these are really useful weapons in a chaotic moment. You don't have to be really accurate. You can just swing through and just hit anything that's in your way. Sweeps everything away. Talk about unity of attack and defence. You've got a big target area. Actually, they're really useful, but they're also, as you can see, quite problematic in a lot of things because they tend to be highly overcommitted movements. That you've got, you know, a big swing is a big committed. It's a big committed posture. It leaves you open in multiple different ways, and it's very hard to pull it back into a fast and usable combination kind of system. It's a division that exists in each one itself, where you see people doing it more like that, and then you see in others more of the use of the hit and stop to kind of try and resolve this hit and stop posture. That's one way of taming big natural set movements, using hit and stop, swinging in and stopping. That still relies on muscular, having the right kind of muscular tension. And in fact, it requires an enormous amount of muscular strength to do that. And it also speaks to the idea that actually, like Zhao Daoxin says, like, actually you probably do need to do some weight training to strengthen up those areas that really that you need for that, to control that power. And then the more you develop Fa Li, the more powerful it is. Induction through more bone-aligned stuff, the ideas that have come from other kinds of martial arts like Shaolin, Yiquan, also don't want to lose that. So each one is like a doctrine of the mean between the two. And it begins to merge these together into combination concepts. For one thing, you can have both as part of the overall stuff that you learn, but you can combine the concepts themselves in different ways. And one of the ways is like straight but not straight kind of punch as well. We're using, it's partly bone alignment back down, and it's partly control, it's partly using the big, it varies between punch to punch. So even between like jab and hook, there's a shift between how far is it bone alignment and how far is it preservation of force through using muscular, I don't want to say strength, it's not specifically about strength. Strength is important, but the concept we're trying to get across is the right amount of combination of relaxation and tension, the right body consistency. So jab uses much more bone alignment for force induction. Hook uses much more muscular consistency for the induction, or more accurately, preservation of force. Well, there's a big difference, for example, between doing like a punch like that, which uses much more, or it tries to use much more bone alignment, but again, the hit point, the bones have got to be in line at the hit point. Otherwise, if you hit like that when they're not in line, you just lose it all again in the joints. But the idea is, and the same with Shaolin Chuan, this very linear kind of punch, it's super linear. It's not the same as a straight but not straight punch. Straight but not straight punch uses elements of both, and it uses elements of both because, why? It helps hunyuan li. It helps this idea that you could structurally expand like this using these outliers and power generation. Again, it's one of the reasons why you have this very characteristic elbows out kind of posture very often in each one. It doesn't matter which kind of each one. It helps hunyuan li to involve some of that more rounded, muscular, natural set kind of force preservation. Or the posture itself, but then you need to use the force preservation of the strength of the muscles to make that work. So you compromise some of the induction of force that you get from a straight punch, but what you get in return is that you can take this punch away from being just a singular thing where it's just the arm, and you can now feed it into a whole system where these become outliers on an expanding entire structure like that, which brings more force back anyway. So there's more force in doing that than there is in doing that, because even though it doesn't look like that, because the whole body is much more powerful than just your arm. And it's also springy, it's more resilient, so it's not brittle in a way that kind of, even if you hit straight dead on like that, you can really injure your hand quite easily, which most of us have done. You did. People who start in Shaolin and then you get in front of the bag in horse stance like that, it's like, ow. So it's over-determined. And then you can also make it bigger, and you can shift much more around and start using much more of the concepts from the natural set with the bigger movements to incorporate that kind of body swing movement, like kind of very primate movement, but incorporating it within an overall structural paradigm using hit and stop. So it creates this doctrine of the mean between the two. So that's just a little bit about the science of force induction and how it works and how those two things come together in each one. And we still have like a spectrum, so that like when we come to look at the natural set, we'll see that like a lot of those moves are still there. The key takeaway is not to think about hunyuan li as, some kind of force or mind force or some kind of, to appoint these expectations of something exotic that you're going to acquire. It's about how your body functions, making it function better, and recognizing that, you can't just get something and then it will just work. It's got to work through a vehicle that's functioning in a particular way, and then just beware these ideas that treats these things like exotic powers that you're going to develop. It's just not like that. So Okay, hope that was helpful. It's quite an advanced, but it builds into a lot of the stuff that we're going to look at moving forward. So it's something to just think about. And when you're looking at other martial arts now, and just have a think about, yeah, that's using much more like bone alignment, or how they're combining the two, bone alignment for force induction versus muscular alignment for force preservation, and how those two things are very often like the one end of a scale or the other. People like martial arts being based on one principle or the other, and then in each one trying to just link these together to create. And then on a more sophisticated level, how that then links into combinations, which is stuff that we've looked at before, because being able to hit and stop and relax and use that muscular preservation of force, but then using that with relaxed muscles to create somatic timing, and how that then links into this kind of thing, how that requires a much more sophisticated use and relaxation of musculature to be able to do that, and how that then links into standing to help us develop this skill. So it all knits together conceptually. So even though it's an advanced concept, it's important to kind of get some of that now as we move forward. Anyway, that's it for today. One love, and I'll see you in the next one.